Welcome to SciFi-preneurship, a new Old Turtles podcast series that examines how science fiction inspires people to create the things that have a real impact on our lives today. I'm Phil Libin, and will be joined in this series by Brittney Gallagher. Hey, Brittney.
Hello. Yeah, so we did a show a while back called Galaxy Quest, which I think was a little bit of the inspiration for this, right?
It actually turned out to be the most popular episode in our first season of the Old Turtles podcast. We kind of talked about this idea in summary, and thought it'd be fun to spin it out over a few more episodes.
Works of science fiction served as an inspiration for the work many people later went on to do. And this series is about science fiction and the people it's impacted.
So the structure that we're going to have is we've got 9 episodes, and in each one, we're going to interview one or more notable people, or at least overachievers, about a particular work of science fiction and how it's been influential in their lives. And we have some pretty cool guests coming up, right? We've got an entrepreneur, we've got a scientist, an astronaut.
No astronauts. Astronaut hopefuls.
Same thing. By the time this thing airs, they'll have been astronauts.
Yeah, we have people working at the forefront of AI and making AI ethical. We have people trying to change medicine as we know it. Directors, film directors. Lots of different people have been inspired by science fiction directly to kind of be where they are today.
But before we get to guests, maybe let's talk about how sci-fi has affected our own lives. Just a little bit about your background and what it means to you.
I remember first seeing The Next Generation, Star Trek, when I was a little kid. And I remember thinking, I want to go to space. And I want to build a world where we live in, where we're actually working to go towards space. And from then, I just started reading as many science fiction books as I could get my hands on. I started reading Asimov, kept going from there, saw The Matrix fairly young, was like, whoa, don't want that. And I remember in high school reading 1984 and thinking, oh, like, really don't want that. And then kind of coming back full circle to Star Trek and really seeing it as this is the world we want. This is a world I should try to work towards building. For the last 8 years or so, I've had a radio show in Los Angeles on science and technology talking about how it's really trying to change and shape the world and trying to educate people as much as possible about how technology can really be a force for good, but we're responsible for making it that way. I also have for years worked in software all over different types of industries. I'm currently working in biotech now.
Well, I remember it started for me when I came to the U.S. with my family when I was 8. I was learning English, and one of the first books that I remember having that I think we bought like at a yard sale or something, or I guess not a yard sale. I grew up in the Bronx. We don't have yards. Somehow I got this used book, and it was already pretty ancient, and it was like this big anthology of science fiction stories. It had some Asimov stories and other things, and it was one of the ways that I kind of learned English. I learned English by reading Thor comic books, and then kind of, this was the more serious version of that because there were no pictures. And I just really fell in love with sci-fi. But at the time, I kind of didn't understand what the point was of anything that wasn't sci-fi. I kind of found Star Trek soon after that, would like watch that with my dad. And anything that wasn't sci-fi just didn't make sense to me. I'm like, I don't understand these other books that aren't about what the world may be like or may not be like, because I don't understand what their purpose is. I don't understand the point of these other TV shows that don't have like spaceships and aliens, because like, what are you supposed to learn from
Friends? Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're much younger than I am. For me, it was like Dynasty. I'm like, Dynasty? Like that's crazy. I don't understand what this like rich people with oil or whatever, pearls, I want Battlestar Galactica. It was just fundamental. And I don't think I even realized that most people weren't quite as into this as I was until much later in life. And in fact, it was kind of that realization in some sense that I think first gave us the idea to even do this series. I was several years ago, I was working as a venture capitalist, and one of my colleagues said to me, you're a giant nerd. And I said, oh, thanks. It's
the best compliment.
Yeah. Usually people aren't nice to me on this job. And she said, well, I guess what I mean is like when I, like you and like all of the other kind of Silicon Valley dudes that are, entrepreneurs or investors, you're all just like, you live in the sci-fi lingo, and it's actually pretty inaccessible for people who didn't grow up in the US, for people who maybe grew up in the US but just weren't immersed in sci-fi culture. You should write something about just explaining sci-fi lingo to people who want to participate in the technology industry but don't have the grounding. And that was kind of the first thought about this, that, hey, maybe we should do this. And then I think you and I started talking about it over dinner, and it just kind of spun out from there.
Yeah, I think science fiction does permeate that barrier. I think like 1984 is a great example. Like, I think even if you haven't read 1984, you have heard of Big Brother.
Right. Yeah. And it isn't just that a bunch of the people in kind of the tech industry, the science industry, talk about that. I think the reason that so many people in the tech industry and in sciences really kind of grew up grounded in science fiction is because I think the best of sci-fi instills this idea of agency, right? Of that you can imagine a world that you want and work towards it, or you can imagine a world that you don't want and try to work against that, and that could be in kind of very big, grand works, or it could be just very specifically. When I was talking with Rhonda was my coworker at the VC firm at General Catalyst, who told me about this. She happened to be reading Snow Crash or rereading Snow Crash, and she came into work one day saying like, "Man, I just can't believe how Neil Stevenson just like predicted everything. He just got everything right about the internet." Snow Crash was written in the 90s, right? And there's a quote in it from 1992 from Snow Crash, where he's just describing a piece of technology, and the quote is, "A globe about the size of a grapefruit, perfectly detailed rendition of planet Earth, hanging in space at arm's length in front of his eyes. Hero has heard about this but never seen it. It's a piece of CIC software called simply Earth." And there's this description about something which is basically Google Earth. Like, if you were going to write a description of Google Earth, a solid 15 years or so before it actually came out, like, it was just perfectly described what Google Earth was. This was kind of unimaginable at the time. And it seems shocking how well Neil Stevenson predicted it. But actually, he didn't predict it, because the guys who made Google Earth have just straight out said that they just read that book and read that description and kind of thought, we can build that.
Yeah.
Like, very directly. And Star Trek is full of this. So there's all of these sci-fi works which were read by nerds like us as basically blueprints of like, oh, here's the kind of stuff you should do. So it wasn't so much a prediction as it was a roadmap.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. Or on the other side of things we should try to prevent. We should build technology to try to prevent something like this from happening. Which the more dystopian works.
Yeah, and those, frankly, may be the more important contribution.
Yeah.
Kind of both in terms of how we should try to structure ourselves to make a world that we prefer to live in, and then what are the pitfalls. So we're calling this podcast Sci-Fi-preneurship because it's really hard to come up with names.
Names are hard.
Yeah, it's basically the best we could do, and we thought about it for literally 7 or 8 minutes.
And then Phil all of a sudden...
Sci-Fi-preneurship. And it just wasn't... We weren't going to actually think of a good name, so that's what it is. Yeah. And it's about how sci-fi affects entrepreneurship, but really, I think a really broad definition of entrepreneurship, right? We don't necessarily mean like people who make startups in San Francisco.
Right.
We mean people who think that they can make things.
Yeah, and make things that are changing the world, I think. Or changing people.
Changing people, making things that make the world, and doing it. The best definition of entrepreneurship that I like is a business school definition. I think it comes from a guy named Stevenson, I think. We'll look that up afterwards. But I think it's a Harvard Business School professor named Stevenson who said, entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity without regard for resources currently controlled, which is kind of a inarticulate way of saying it, but I really love that quote anyway. Entrepreneurship is like you see what you want to make and then you pursue that without really thinking about like, well, what do I already have? Like, what is the world already like and how can I build from it? It's just this like pursuit of what it should be. Which I think is an elegant way to talk about what a lot of our guests are doing.
In quote, I think that embodies this, though it's a little bit more about books in particular, but how they influence us is by Ursula K. Le Guin. We read books to find out who we are, what other people, real or imaginary, do and think and feel. It is an essential guide to our understanding of what we ourselves are and may become.
I think that's a great quote, and we actually have 2 episodes coming up about Ursula K. Le Guin. I think one of the most fundamental sci-fi authors about this concept of agency. But we're going to start out in a darker place with our first book, or our first author, who's H.P. Lovecraft.
In the bowels of horror and dystopia with H.P. Lovecraft.
I think there's some disagreement in the sci-fi community about whether or not H.P. Lovecraft even qualifies for science fiction, or whether it's horror or weird fiction or whatever you want to call it. But I always thought starting with H.P. Lovecraft is a good way to ground all of this, because H.P. Lovecraft writes a particular type of dystopia, but it's a particular type of dystopia that really denies people all agency. It's basically saying that the best we can do is not understand things, not pursue knowledge, that the world is terrible and malicious and out to get us and will get us and nothing can be done. And the more we understand it, the closer we are to our own demise. And he was writing mostly between World War I and World War II, during the period of history where the world has just seen the greatest horror that it had seen before, World War I, and was on its way to something even worse than that. And I think there was the sense that this was driven in large part by industrialization, by science, by technology. H.P. Lovecraft was, I think, pining for a simpler time before we had all of this fancy science that could just be used to kill millions and millions of people.
Yeah, the ignorance is bliss kind of way of thinking. Most episodes will feature conversations with multiple people, but today we'll ease into it a bit with an interview with just one person, Dan Novy. Dan works at the MIT Media Lab, where he created a class called Sci-Fi to Sci-Fab. He also was the visual effects supervisor for the silent film adaptation of Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft's Historical Society, which makes him kind of the perfect person to talk about Lovecraft. Dan has since earned his PhD from MIT. Let's meet Dan.
I teach a science fiction class here at the Media Lab. It's called SciFab, or Science Fiction Inspired Prototyping. It was originally developed with Sophia Bruckner as SciFab, or Sci-Fi to Sci-Fab, and we've repeated the class several times now. And the basic explanation is that we assign science fiction reading, video games, films, we're agnostic as to format, and then assign the student to build something that they find in the science fiction. So to make science reality out of science fiction.
And how has science fiction as a whole been an inspiration to you and to where you are now?
I think my career goes as far back as being a child and being inspired by things like, 2001, easily things like Battlestar Galactica, things like Star Blazers, which was Space Battleship Yamato. I literally built a space shuttle simulator using an Atari 2600 and the space shuttle game, which was the first video game I ever spent my own money on, using a TV tipped back and a chair tipped back and a refrigerator box. So I've been sort of building simulated environments and simulated experiences, science fiction experiences since, the late 70s. When I was in undergraduate and then later my first graduate degree in theater, I got into virtual reality production. So virtual reality in like 1993, 95, not ready for prime time. The hardware wasn't really there, but I was attempting to do these sort of science fiction-like experiences, realizing that theater itself was the first form of virtual reality, with wood and paint and story and song and word, but then trying to figure out what is going to be the sort of like next wave of storytelling. And then from there, I had taught myself all of these skills. I moved to Hollywood, and that's how I became a visual effects technical supervisor for, almost the next 20 years, working on science fiction films like Red Planet or Day the Earth Stood Still, designing, the interfaces that the astronauts use in Red Planet, designing ships, doing 3D animation of launch sequences and robots and things like that. So science fiction has always been a sort of pervasive undercurrent of my life, both in properties that I enjoyed, but also in literally striving to bring about a sci-fi future.
Quite the storied background. So today we're starting out with H.P. Lovecraft. What is it about Lovecraft's work that has stuck with you?
So H.P. Lovecraft for me is very much, again, like Herbert and like Le Guin, most people don't consider it science fiction. Lots of people will tell you it's just fantasy or it's horror. They don't actually understand that a lot of the horror in Lovecraft comes from the stars. That comes from interstellar travelers of deep age. So it is a science fiction story, and a lot of science fiction ends up in Lovecraft being swept under the rug because of the more cosmic horror and dark horror themes. I was introduced to H.P. Lovecraft as an undergraduate, again, by members of what would become the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. And we would usually play live action Call of Cthulhu. So you imagine sometimes you LARP with certain people and, they can kind of get into it. But we were all theater majors. So you can imagine LARPing with theater majors who had all just taken puppetry classes, who did special effects makeups, who did visual effects. So we would have these deep weekend-long Lovecraft adventures with special effects and puppetry and emulated altered states of consciousness, helmets that you would put on that had recording devices put into them. So you would hear a certain hallucination that another person, it was randomized, so you didn't hear it there. And so for me, this was my introduction to Lovecraft. It was actually playing these characters, this pulp fiction, cosmic horror. And then I went and discovered the books and started reading them. So for me, again, it was like, I experienced it, went and found the fundamentals in the book. And to this day, those relationships are still very active. That's how I ended up being the visual effects supervisor for the silent film adaptation of Call of Cthulhu done by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, and ended up working on subsequent films as well as labors of love, essentially.
I kind of see Lovecraft, like Call of Cthulhu in particular, but really a bunch of the works as almost this definition of, I'm thinking of it as like it's Copernicanism kind of taking to the next level, meaning that not only is man not at the center of the universe, not only are we insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but in fact the rest of the universe is like neutral at the very best towards us, and realistically, actually fairly hostile.
Yes, the universe is actually trying to kill us.
Yeah, and but like not so much trying, because actually, if it tried, it would, pretty much immediately. But it's got this like generally negative indifference at best, and some hostility. And so, our attempt to understand the universe, our attempt to pursue science, is actually just like pointless, but also like really harmful. We just shouldn't do it. And it kind of putting this into historical perspective of when this was written, post-World War I, it just seems like a really interesting way to start the 20th century in the pursuit of technology, where you can just say, well, it's actually all going to be like super actively bad.
Yeah, the war to end all wars, the first great mechanized war where science was really used to create weapons, really weapons of mass destruction, and some pretty heinous, terrible weapons at that. I think that is reflected in ideas of Lovecraft of we can't conceive of the true size and intent of the universe in any way, but also what we then go on to create is essentially destructive in some way.
Right. And even, some of the other stories talking about non-Euclidean geometry. And if you stare at equations the wrong way for slightly too long, you can, summon forth demons that don't really care about you, but will just kill you anyway, because they're, that's what they do.
And for me, it's some of the smaller stories, like the Music of Eric Zahn. I mean, that one, for me, it's a short story. It gets right to the chase. And for me, that is sort of like the fundamental Lovecraft. It's like he's just going deeper and deeper in and keeps going and doesn't realize he needs to back out. And things just get weirder and weirder from there until it's too late. And then it's over. And then you have to sleep with the lights on and put the book in the freezer because, you totally freaked yourself out.
Not that, having your lights on would save you.
Would help at all, of course, yes.
But you could just see it coming. It helps when you can see it, right?
But this was like this very, I'd say like vaguely, like unfocused, deep dread and pessimism about the future of society and technology. Like Lovecraft never quite came out and said like, what were the things that were wrong? It was all, it was all ineffable. It was all like, if you think about it too much, you go crazy. Which then evolved, I think, later in the 20th century, post-World War II, into the much more specific dystopias of, 1984, Brave New World, which actually had, like, well-drawn versions of exactly how society was going to go bad. Like, Lovecraft had, like, I've got a bad feeling about this. And, the stories were about other people who got too close and then went crazy without ever actually seeing, for the most part, what it was that made them crazy. And then that evolved into went from, like, sort of vaguely ominous and negative to specifically ominous and negative before it got better with with Asimov and things like that.
The dread and unease that you can't actually name at some point.
Right.
And that's what makes Lovecraft sort of fun in the modern era, is finding him and his work and the others that built the Cthulhu mythos after him in your favorite works. So certainly being a Mignola fan, part of the reason I love Hellboy so much is that Lovecraftian universe that's sort of been grafted on as part of it.
Do you think that the mythos, the kind of the vibe, like has it influenced you at all? Has it shaped you in any way?
I think so. I realize now that I misspoke, because my first introduction to Lovecraft was I had the edition of the Deities and Demigods that had the Lovecraft mythos in it before it was removed for copyright purposes.
Exactly. It was our first introduction to copyright law as well as...
I was like, wait, why doesn't this suddenly have this in there? And so, the idea of creeping horrors and copyright, are indelibly linked in my mind now because of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's interesting. This idea that there was things that are unknowable, and more than unknowable, like shouldn't be known. This was before the atomic bomb, right? Like this, prefigures Oppenheimer and all of this by a few decades. This idea that if you reach too far,
you're going to blow yourself up.
Yeah, it's all bad.
Yeah, there's one particular story of a scientist that is essentially doing work on the pituitary gland. So he is, stimulating a very focused portion of the human brain, and things do not go well for him. And so, I've had to actually think about that story deeply in my work.
Thank you, Dan, so much. I love talking sci-fi with you, and hopefully I'll see you in the real world someday soon.
Thank you.
Even if Lovecraft's work may be misinterpreted as horror, I think there's also a pretty big science fiction aspect to it, because he really gives us an idea of a society that maybe we don't want, and a way to think about this as a future that maybe we shouldn't be building, and think about things and how they'll affect society as we're building them.
Yeah, and I think he doesn't offer any solutions.
Right. He's not solutions-oriented.
Right. He is calling out a problem, and it's a problem that's so dramatic, the overuse of science and technology leading to the complete annihilation of humanity, inevitably, that just the problem statement, I think, is worthwhile, right? He's basically saying that just because we can do something with our newfangled science doesn't mean we should. And I think that's kind of a timeless message. That's aged well.
Yeah. Especially now. And I think we'll probably say that in 30 years, especially now. It's aged well.
So I think we're going to end these episodes by just reading our one quote that had the biggest influence on us from these works, and just letting the audience think about that while waiting for the next podcast.
Yeah.
Marinate. So marinate in this. What I think is the most influential quote. This is right from the start of The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the ineffably evil but world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Dan Novy for joining us today. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plogue for his audio expertise, Ali Packard for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Brittney Gallagher and yours truly, Phil Libin, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.